I found the journal 3 days after my parents died in the car accident. It was hidden behind a loose baseboard in their bedroom closet, wrapped in plastic like evidence from a crime scene. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before their death. Sarah can never know what we did. The house remembers everything. My name is Sarah. I was 24 when I inherited the house where I grew up, a modest 2-story colonial in Millbrook, Connecticut. After the funeral, I couldn't bear to return to my cramped Boston apartment, so I decided to stay for a few weeks while sorting through their belongings. The mortgage was paid off, the utilities still ran, and honestly, I needed time to process everything. The first week was therapeutic. I organized photo albums, donated clothes, and slowly began to understand my parents as people rather than just mom and dad. They'd been young once, adventurous once. There were travel photos I'd never seen, letters between them from when Dad was deployed overseas, evidence of a rich life that existed before I came along. Then I found the journal, and everything I thought I knew about my childhood became a lie. According to my mother's careful handwriting, I had a twin brother named Michael. He was born 12 minutes after me on October 15th, 1999. But according to every official document I'd ever seen, I was an only child. The early entries were typical new mother observations. Sarah slept through the night. Michael didn't. Both babies are healthy, but Michael seems more sensitive to noise. Normal stuff. But as the months progressed, the entries became concerning. Michael won't stop crying. We've tried everything. Sarah sleeps peacefully, but he screams for hours. The neighbors are starting to complain. Dr. Patterson says some babies are just fussy, but there's something in Michael's eyes. He looks at things that aren't there. Found Michael standing in his crib this morning, staring at the ceiling. He's only 8 months old. Babies can't stand at 8 months. The entries stopped abruptly when I turned 2 years old. But there was one final entry, dated 15 years later, written in my father's handwriting. Sarah asked about the extra bedroom again today. We told her it was storage, like always. She's getting older, more curious. What happens when she starts dating? When she brings someone home? How do we explain the sounds? I sat on my parents' bed, reading this by lamplight, and felt my entire reality shifting. There was no extra bedroom in our house. I'd lived here for 18 years before leaving for college, and I knew every inch of it. 3 bedrooms upstairs, mine, my parents', and Dad's office. That was it. But as I sat there, I realized I could hear something I'd never consciously noticed before. A faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls. Rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails on wood. I got up and walked the hallway, pressing my ear to different spots on the wall between my old bedroom and my parents' room. The sound was strongest near a section that had always been covered by a large bookshelf. It took me 20 minutes to move all the books and slide the heavy oak shelf aside. Behind it was a door, not a hidden passage or secret room from some Gothic novel, just a normal bedroom door, painted the same cream color as all the others in the house. There was even a brass nameplate screwed into the wood. Michael. My hands were shaking as I turned the handle. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a single window that had been painted black from the inside. There was a twin bed with rumpled sheets, children's toys scattered on the floor, and crayon drawings taped to the walls. The drawings were all the same thing, repeated dozens of times. 2 stick figures holding hands, one labeled Sarah and one labeled me. But the most disturbing thing was how recent everything looked. The sheets weren't dusty, the crayons weren't dried out. There was a glass of water on the nightstand that was still half full. Someone had been living in this room. I backed out and pulled the door shut, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of breakdown. Grief could cause hallucinations, right? I was projecting childhood trauma onto my environment, creating mystery where none existed. The journal was probably some creative writing exercise my mother had never finished. But when I went to bed that night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful footsteps, like someone trying not to be heard. They paused outside my bedroom door for a long time before continuing toward my parents' room. I lay there frozen, listening as whoever it was moved around in there, opening drawers, rustling through papers. I called out, "Hello?" But the sound stopped immediately. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been the house settling. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows that. But when I went to brush my teeth, there were 2 toothbrushes in the holder. I'd only put one there the night before. That's when I called my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, who lived 2 towns over. "Aunt Pat," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to ask you something about when I was little. Did I ever have a brother?" The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Sarah," she finally said, and her voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. "Where are you right now?" "I'm at Mom and Dad's house. I found some things, and I just need to know. Get out of that house." Her voice was sharp now, urgent. "Right now, come to my place. We need to talk." I drove to Patricia's house in a daze, my mind churning through possibilities. When she opened the door, she looked like she'd aged 5 years since the funeral. "I always told your parents this day would come," she said, leading me to her kitchen table. "I told them you'd figure it out eventually." She poured 2 cups of coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "You did have a twin brother, Sarah. His name was Michael. But he died when you were both 3 years old." The coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. "It was an accident," Patricia continued. "You were both playing in the backyard. There was an old well that your father had been meaning to cover up. Michael fell in. By the time they got him out, she didn't need to finish. Your parents were devastated. Your mother especially. She couldn't accept that he was gone. She kept his room exactly as it was, kept buying him clothes, kept setting a place for him at dinner. Your father was worried about what it was doing to you. A 3-year-old trying to understand why Mommy kept talking to empty air. I felt nauseous. So they moved his things. They sealed off his room. Your father built a false wall, made it look like storage space, but your mother, she never really let go. Sometimes I'd come visit and find her in there, talking to him like he was still alive. She'd leave food for him, read him bedtime stories. Patricia reached across the table and took my hand. Your parents weren't bad people, Sarah. They were just broken. And sometimes broken people do things that don't make sense to the rest of us. I drove back to the house that evening, Patricia's words echoing in my head. It all made sense now. The journal entries, the preserved room, even the sounds I'd been hearing. Probably just the house's old pipes and settling foundation, amplified by my own emotional state. But when I walked through the front door, there was a plate of cookies on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there when I left. They were chocolate chip, still warm from the oven. My mother's recipe, the kind she used to make for special occasions. I knew because I'd eaten thousands of them growing up. The smell was exactly right, down to the hint of vanilla she always added. I checked the oven. It was off and cool to the touch. That night, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, I forced myself to get up and investigate. I crept into the hallway and saw a thin line of light under the door to Michael's room. Light where there should be none, because the window was painted black and I hadn't turned on any lights. I pressed my ear to the door and heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of a child humming. The same lullaby my mother used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to my dead brother hum in his sealed room, until the sound finally stopped, and the light went out. The next morning, I found more evidence. Small sneaker prints in the bathroom, about the size a 3-year-old would make. a glass that had been moved from one counter to another, a book in the living room that was open to a different page than where I'd left it. I started keeping a notebook, documenting everything. The sounds I heard, the objects that moved, the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. Part of me thought I was losing my mind, but the evidence was accumulating faster than I could rationalize it away. Then, exactly 2 weeks after finding the journal, I woke up to find a crayon drawing slipped under my bedroom door. It showed 2 stick figures in a house. One was labeled Sarah and was drawn in the living room. The other, labeled Michael, was drawn in the basement. At the bottom, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Come find me." I'd never seen the basement. In all my years living in this house, I'd never once been shown the basement. The door was always locked, and when I asked about it as a child, my parents would change the subject. I'd assumed it was just storage, or maybe an unfinished space that wasn't worth showing off. The basement door was at the end of the kitchen, painted the same white as the cabinets, easy to overlook if you weren't looking for it. I'd walked past it thousands of times without giving it a second thought. Now, standing in front of it at 3 a.m. with a flashlight in my hand, I realized the door was slightly ajar. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I descended into darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. The air was thick and humid, with a smell I couldn't identify. Not quite decay, but something organic and wrong. The basement was larger than I'd expected, stretching under most of the house's footprint. But it wasn't empty storage. It was furnished like a child's playroom, complete with toys, books, and a small table with 2 chairs. Everything was arranged as if someone had just been playing there. Blocks were stacked into towers, picture books lay open, and there were 2 cups on the little table, both half full of what looked like milk. But the most disturbing thing was the walls. They were covered in children's artwork, hundreds of drawings taped from floor to ceiling. All of them showed the same thing: 2 children playing together. Sarah and Michael at the park. Sarah and Michael building blocks. Sarah and Michael forever. I walked deeper into the basement, my flashlight revealing more and more drawings. Some looked old, the paper yellowed with age, but others were clearly recent, the colors still bright, the tape still sticky. At the far end of the basement, I found something that made me drop my flashlight. A well. The same well my brother had fallen into 21 years ago. It wasn't filled in or covered. It was still there, a perfect circle of darkness in the basement floor, about 4 feet across. When I picked up my flashlight and shined it down into the opening, I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear something down there. Splashing, like someone was playing in water. I backed away from the well, my heart hammering, and that's when I heard the voice. Sarah? It was small, young, exactly what I imagined a 3-year-old would sound like. Sarah, is that you? I ran. I ran up those basement stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life, slammed the door behind me, and didn't stop running until I was in my car, driving toward town at 70 miles per hour. I checked into a motel and sat on the scratchy bedspread, trying to process what I'd seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Underground springs could cause water sounds. Old houses had all kinds of acoustic tricks. The drawings could have been done by my mother during her grief, a way of keeping Michael's memory alive. But that voice... I stayed at the motel for 3 days, going back to the house only during daylight hours to pack my things. I was going to sell the place and never look back. Let someone else deal with whatever was happening there. On the 3rd day, I found a letter waiting for me at the front desk. No return address, just my name written in a child's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, it said, "Please don't leave me alone again." That's when I realized the truth wasn't supernatural at all. It was much worse. I drove back to the house and went straight to the basement. This time I brought proper equipment, a high-powered flashlight, rope, and my phone to record everything. The well was still there, still dark, still making those splashing sounds. But when I shined my light down into it, I could see something my panicked mind had missed before. There was no water down there. There was a person, a man, probably in his 40s, sitting in what looked like a makeshift shelter built into the well shaft. He looked up at me with eyes that were wild but unmistakably intelligent. "Please don't call the police," he said, and his voice was different now, not a child's voice, but an adult trying to sound like a child. "I know this looks bad, but I can explain." His name was David Reeves, and he'd been living in my parents' basement for 6 years. It started, he explained, when he was homeless and desperate. He'd broken into the house while my parents were away, just looking for food and maybe a place to sleep for one night. But when he discovered the sealed room, the preserved bedroom of a dead child, he realized he'd stumbled into something he could use. "Your mother left food out," he said, still sitting in that horrible well. At first I thought it was for a pet, but then I heard her talking to someone who wasn't there. She was talking to Michael. David was smart enough to realize that my mother's grief had created an opportunity. If she wanted to believe her dead son was still around, he could be that son. He learned everything about Michael from the preserved room, from the journal entries he found, from listening to my parents' conversations. "I never meant for it to go on so long," he said. "But your mother was so happy when she thought Michael was responding to her. She left better food, bought new toys, even had conversations with the empty room. And your father, he was just relieved that she seemed to be getting better." For 6 years, David Reeves had been living in my house, letting my parents believe their dead son was communicating with them from beyond. He'd exit and enter through a basement window that was hidden by overgrown bushes. During the day, when my parents were at work, he'd use their shower, eat their food, even watch their television. "When they died," he said, "I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving, but then you came back, and you looked so much like her, like your mother. I thought maybe..." He'd been trying to recreate the same dynamic with me. The moved objects, the child's drawings, the cookies. All of it was David, trying to make me believe my dead brother was reaching out to me. "I'm not a bad person," he insisted as I called 911. "I never hurt them. I made them happy. Your mother smiled more in those 6 years than she had since the accident. Isn't that worth something?" The police found evidence that David had been living in dozens of houses over the years, always targeting families with some kind of loss, always positioning himself as the bridge between the living and the dead. He had identification documents for multiple deceased children, birth certificates he'd somehow obtained, even social security numbers. The well, it turned out, wasn't the original well where Michael had died. David had dug it himself, creating a hiding place that he could access from both the basement and from outside through a hidden entrance. He'd spent years perfecting his setup, making it look like something that had always been there. During his trial, psychiatrists diagnosed him with a severe personality disorder, but not the kind that made him violent. David Reeves was what they called a grief vampire, someone who fed off other people's sorrow, who inserted himself into their trauma and fed off their need to believe in something beyond death. "The tragedy," the prosecutor said during closing arguments, "is not just what Mr. Reeves did to this family, but how desperately they wanted to believe him. Grief makes us vulnerable to those who would exploit our love for the people we've lost." I sold the house a month after David's conviction. The new owners were a young couple with no children, no recent losses, no vulnerabilities for someone like David to exploit. I told them about the sealed room, the basement well, all of it. They thanked me for my honesty and said they were planning to renovate everything anyway. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment across the country, I think about those 6 years. I think about my mother, setting out plates of food and having conversations with empty air, and how happy she must have been to believe Michael was still with her somehow. And I think about David Reeves, sitting in that basement well, learning to mimic a 3-year-old's voice, perfecting his impression of a dead child. The most disturbing part wasn't that he fooled my parents. It was that, for a few days, he almost fooled me too. Because when you lose someone you love, you'll believe almost anything if it means you get to keep them just a little bit longer.